Grant of Chapter 5, Part 4, Coverage, Non-Exchange Overview, Grants. Non-exchange expenditures. GASB standards applicable to both modified and full accrual accounting statements. Non-exchange expenditures should generally be recognized with their revenue counterparts. For example, when the recipient of the grant has satisfied all eligibility requirements. Non-exchange expenses. Grants would be recognized as expenses in the same period in the government-wide as in the fund financial statements. Modified accrual statements. Revenues must be available for expenditure before they can be recognized. Example, December 2015, the city approves a $300,000 grant to a not-for-profit health clinic. The funds are to be paid in 2016 out of funds budgeted for that year and are intended to support the clinic's activities in 2016. The General Fund. Inasmuch as the clinic cannot use the funds until 2016, the grant is subject to a time requirement. The city need not recognize either a liability or an expenditure until 2016 when the time requirement is satisfied. The only action has been the approval of the grant. There is no 2015 entry. Government-wide, same treatment. Example 2. The city awards in 2015 a not-for-profit clinic a $400,000 grant for the acquisition of emergency communications equipment. Payment is made at the time the award is announced. The clinic is permitted to use the funds upon receipt, but intends to use them in 2016. Purpose restrictions have no impact on the timing of either expenditure or revenue recognition. The city must recognize an expenditure as soon as it expends the funds and the not-for-profit clinic is eligible to spend them. So the governmental fund, debit grant expenditure, credit cash. Government-wide, the same treatment, but use expense instead of expenditure. Always remember that government-wide is not a real entry, simply a conversion at the end of the period to convert from modified accrual to full accrual. Example 3, 2015, the city awards a not-for-profit $200,000 for the acquisition of emergency communications equipment. The grant is to be paid as the organization incurs and documents allowable cost. In 2016, the organization submits claims for $150,000, of which the city pays $125,000. The city expects to pay the $25,000 balance of claims submitted in January 17 and the $50,000 balance of the grant by June of 17. The not-for-profit is eligible for the award only as it incurs and documents allowable cost. In 2016, the city became eligible for $150,000 of the grant and the amount the city should recognize as an expenditure. So General Fund, we debit grant expenditure, credit cash for the $125,000 and grants payable for the balance due, the $25,000. Government-wide is the same, except it's expense instead of expenditure, and we know that government-wide is not a real entry but just a conversion made at the end of the year to convert from modified accrual to full accrual. Example 4. Assume a grant of $100,000 is received by the city at the beginning of the fiscal year from the federal government. The entry in the special revenue fund is a debit to cash but a credit to deferred revenue until eligibility requirements for the grant have been met by incurring expenditures for the intended purpose. The exchange transaction is reported as deferred revenue, a liability. Continued. Assume that during the year the counseling program expended $75,000 for costs related to youth counseling, thus meeting the eligibility requirement to expend grant resources. Now we have a debit to expenditures, credit to vouchers payable, but we also have a debit to deferred revenues to reduce the liability and a credit to record the revenues.